Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for class for Wednesday, the 12th of October, where we are moving from Poe going to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is a novella, which means that it's longer than a short story. And of course, we've been reading short stories with Poe, but it's not quite as long as a novel, which is how we began this semester when we were reading Frankenstein. You'll remember that I gave you an extension with your Poe journal because we had fallen a little bit behind. So if you are watching this video today on the 12th, that is the date in which your Poe journal is due, Wednesday, October 12th by 11:59 p.m. to my email the way we usually do, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And as I indicated, there are a lot of different ways you could respond to Poe. You might want to address each of the short stories in turn. You might want to focus on one short story. For instance, you might just want to focus on the fall of the House of Usher. Even though I know from your discussion responses that wasn't necessarily your favorite story, but I think it does a wonderful job in terms of establishing atmosphere, which Poe is very good at. And just this idea that the brother, the sister, and the house serve as a kind of trinity, an unholy trinity, is something that we'll re-examine when we get to Dracula and also talk about unholy trinities. But the in-between place would be that you examine 2 or maybe even 3 of the short stories. Doesn't necessarily matter, but what you will want to do when we get to our third journal, which happens to be about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, is devote your journal to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And you'll remember that I talked a little bit about writing papers because ultimately you will be writing a paper, which is a much more formal exercise than what you would be doing with a journal. A journal is basically just about your reflections and your opinions and your responses. And you don't necessarily need to have one central thesis or idea that you are supporting throughout. So I think of it more as a kind of dialogue on paper, almost like a diary entry. But the distinction being, rather than you talking about your personal life, what you're doing is you are talking about the text. Now, the papers are a little bit different because the papers would be focusing on one particular element from one of the major Gothic texts we've talked about this semester. I'm assuming that would either be Frankenstein or one or several of Poe's short stories, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dracula is also a possibility, but do note that Dracula is going to straddle both the first and the second part of the semester, so you might want to save Dracula for your second paper, since your second paper will be very similar to the first paper, where I'm asking you to respond in about 4 to 5 pages, double space, 1-inch margins, but as long as the paper needs to be to support your thesis, which means that you need to have a central idea that you are examining in one of the texts. And I had provided you with some general contents or some general topics that you could consider, but ultimately I didn't provide you with a thesis. That's something that you would need to develop. However, what you can do is review some of the class videos, you can review some of the class discussion forum questions, and your own journals as well, and hopefully that would give you some inspiration for the paper. Now, the paper isn't going to be due for a little while. According to our syllabus, the paper isn't going to be due until the 2nd of November, and that is a Wednesday. However, I wanted you to begin thinking about it sooner rather than later. And if you'll remember, I had also reviewed a handout that I had been given myself when I was an undergraduate about writing critical papers, which is what you are going to be doing. Not writing a research paper, but basically your own thoughts and analysis. That said, if you really wanted to write a research paper, I'm not necessarily averse to it. Just understand that it is usually a more challenging exercise because not only do you have to incorporate what other people have said about a text, but you still need to come up with your own original commentary. And part of my goals of this class is that you could approach a text after the class is over and be able to make sense out of it without a class or without an instructor. So the idea that you are working on your critical thinking skills in the paper should help you with your critical reading skills in the future. So in the syllabus and other documents folder is where I had placed that handout that talked about 3 stages for writing a paper. The planning stage, and I really encourage you to spend some time and effort and thought doing that because it's usually skipped over. The writing stage, and you could spend, I suppose, a lifetime refining and developing your writing. You don't have that lifetime, obviously, but you do the best you can with the time that you've got so that you can review the sentences and ask yourself, are there better ways of constructing these sentences? And then finally, the editing piece. And that's, again, something that oftentimes is neglected because people have run out of time and run out of energy by that point when they are writing a paper. So I encourage you to reserve a little bit of extra. And I talked a little bit about the importance of the introduction because the introduction doesn't just give your thesis, your main point, but it also states the author and the name of the text. So it should be very clear to the reader what your paper is going to be about based on that opening paragraph. Your body paragraphs, the middle paragraphs, are where you add your evidence and your detail. Notice I said paragraphs in the plural, and each paragraph should be devoted to a new idea. And this is where you want to use quotation and paraphrase, and that's what I wanted to talk a little bit more about. Some of the conventions for quotation. Paraphrase is when you use your own language, but if you're quoting, you are writing it out exactly word for word, and there's some conventions that you need to follow to illustrate that that is a quote and also to let the reader know where you can find that quote from. Think of yourself as a kind of attorney gathering up pieces of evidence in order to support a position. And a good attorney can argue either side of a case. So in theory, you could argue multiple elements, and oftentimes they could be papers that contradict one another, but all those papers could be A papers if they were constructed in such a way so that the argument is possible. It doesn't even have to necessarily be probable, just possible. So this is where the quotation and the paraphrase and the analysis comes in your body paragraphs. And we talked about that a paragraph is a developed idea, which means that it should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, at the very least 3 sentences. And the first sentence, if it's well written, is the topic sentence that summarizes what the paragraph is about. So in theory, you could read your opening sentences and get a kind of outline. And then we have the concluding paragraph, and that needs to be as well developed as any other paragraph. And this is where we give closure. We don't really introduce any new arguments. This is where we could relate at another work by the same author, or perhaps relate what we're reading to contemporary times, or perhaps just restate our thesis. But of course, you don't want to just recopy what you had in your introduction. So if you'll notice in the notes below, under the second section, I have documentation. This is the MLA, the Modern Language Association System. This is the documentation system we use in the humanities. That includes English classes. And they use a system called parenthetical documentation, which means that they are using parentheses immediately after a quote. Whether you're finished with the sentence or not, that's irrelevant. But immediately after a direct quote, you use parentheses, and within those parentheses, you indicate where that quote could be found. Your job is to provide the least amount of information in the parentheses necessary for a reader to be able to figure out where the quote could be found, so a reader could verify it if they so wanted to. And that said, that usually means a page number within the parentheses. But you might need to add additional information. For instance, you might need to give the author's last name and page number if it's unclear which text you are referencing. And if there are multiple texts by the same author, you might need to give part of the title, the author's last name, and the page number. And there are different conventions for citing different things. And this is where going to the MLA source book is very useful because you can look up the specific way that one would go about quoting. But as I indicated in our notes below, I just gave you a few examples of what it would look like if you were using the MLA system for documentation. And note that punctuation goes after the parentheses, after the documentation. So your first example is, quote, Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote. Immediately after that, we open a parentheses, we put the number 162, close the parentheses, and then we have our ending punctuation. Notice I'm not writing P or PG or PAGE in there. The number assumes that, or the number implies that we can assume that that is the page number. Now, if a sentence continues after documentation, there's an example of that as well. Quote, although Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote, and then in the parentheses 162, and now I continue on with my sentence. He cannot pray with his mother. That's not a quote, but that was my language, and then of course I put the ending punctuation. Now, usually we don't insert something into a quote, but if you wanted to insert something into a quote, and that would be for clarification purposes, not for analysis, you would use a square brackets, not a parentheses, a square brackets, and you can see an example of that in our notes below for the insertion. Quote, even his, and then notice in the square brackets what I've got are Krebs's, and then I close my square brackets. Lies were not sensational, unquote, and then I have my parentheses, and within the parentheses, the page number, and then, of course, the closing punctuation. So what that indicates is that within those square brackets, not parentheses, but square brackets, that's my language. That wasn't part of the original quote. Usually we do that to clarify something like a pronoun. So in this instance, we have the pronoun his, which could have referred to a number of characters within the story. So I wanted to clarify that. So in my square brackets, I clarified that by giving the name of the individual that the pronoun was replacing. And again, you do this very rarely. It would be comparable to perhaps interrupting somebody when they're speaking. You just do it to clarify. You can also omit part of a quote. You wouldn't omit a part of the quote to change its meaning. That would be unethical. But you could omit part of a quote because it just isn't relevant to your purposes. And you can see an example of that below as well. An omission, and this sentence reads, Krebs, comma, quote, during his time, ... or period, was sleeping late in bed, unquote, and then I have my parentheses with the page number within the parentheses, close parentheses, and the ending punctuation. So if you ever see those 3 periods within a quote or those 3 dots, that's known as an ellipsis. That means that you are omitting a word or several words that, again, just aren't relevant. And keep in mind that you can decide where to begin and end a quote, so you don't need to begin or end a quote with an ellipsis. You can start a quote in mid-sentence if you want it. But between the starting point and the ending point of the quote that you've selected, between point A and point B, if you leave out something in the middle, then you use the ellipsis. So I just wanted you to see some examples of that. And if you'll remember, I had suggested resources such as Purdue OWL, and I've reposted the link in our notes below, as well as just the GCC library, because they also have put together citation guides because they're well aware that you're writing research papers. So we're moving into Jekyll and Hyde, and I wanted to talk a little bit about 1800 society. It's a very repressive society, particularly in regards to sexuality. The importance of appearance was first and foremost. Sexuality was for procreation, not for pleasure, and it was to be done in marriage. That said, there was an incredibly high rate of venereal disease at the time and a thriving prostitution trade. So this was also a time of great hypocrisy. So keep that in mind as you are reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's also the time of Freud and some of Freud's theories of psychoanalysis. And I think you will see in Jekyll and Hyde that many psychological theories that Freud had proposed could be applicable to the text. Specifically, the idea of the id, the ego, and the superego. If you've ever taken a psychology class, you'll know that basically that was the way that Freud characterized personality. That the id was our base instincts. The superego was basically our attempt to be as honorable as possible, and the ego tried to manage the two. So if you think about some of those old cartoons where you've got an angel on one hand or on one shoulder and a devil on the other shoulder, I suppose you could think of the angel as the superego, your conscience, and you could think of the devil as the id, your base instincts, with the ego trying to balance the two. Keep that in mind as you are also reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Darwinism was also important. So this idea about regression or progression is something that we will see, survival of the fittest, in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. A kind of reverse Darwinism is what we are going to see with Jekyll and Hyde, a kind of regression back into baser instincts. 2 years after the novel, the Jack the Ripper murders occurred. Very famous murders that to this day have yet to be solved, occurring in London, targeting prostitutes. And the prevailing theory was and is that the murderer was someone who had a good amount of medical knowledge just because of the way the murders were conducted with a lot of surgical precision. So while Jack the Ripper wasn't necessarily the inspiration for the text, I think there are enough parallels with Jack the Ripper, particularly when some of the performances of Jekyll and Hyde appeared during the Jack the Ripper period, where individuals were actually identifying some of the actors on stage playing Jekyll and Hyde as Jack the Ripper. Now, Robert Louis Stevenson, who happens to be the author of Jekyll and Hyde, a Scottish novelist who had a good number of health problems. This idea of sickness and health and medication is also going to be another theme that you will see in Jekyll and Hyde. You might know Robert Louis Stevenson from his adventure novel, Treasure Island. And again, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is his novella. Usually when we talk about Gothic texts, the three major Gothic texts from the 1800s are usually identified as Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and finally, Dracula. And if you are using the edition of the text that I had ordered for class, you'll see that they are all combined in one text with the foreword by Stephen King, no less. So some of the themes, as I had indicated, that you can expect to find. This idea of repression, though we saw some of that as well with Poe and perhaps even with Frankenstein. Socioeconomic class. The Victorian period was a time of economic extremes, with the very wealthy and the very poor sometimes living almost side by side next to one another. This idea of drug use and abuse is something that we will see evidenced in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Many have argued that it was a way for Stevenson to deal with his own medical issues and drug use. Darwinism, as I had indicated earlier, and this idea of whether or not we can progress or regress. The psyche, as I was suggesting, the id, the ego, and the superego with Freud. Doubling, which we've seen many times already in just the few texts that we've read. We know that the idea of double and doppelganger, the two sides to personality perhaps, are things that are oftentimes examined in the Gothic. Movie adaptations. There are quite a few movie adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde. Usually they take a good number of textual liberties. We've seen this before when we saw the definitive perhaps I would say the definitive 1930s version of Frankenstein. And we will see this again when we see the Frederick March version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because we will be watching that over the next couple of classes. And we know that oftentimes texts will take textual liberties, or movies will take texts and use textual liberties because they want to reduce length, for instance, or they want to simplify plot, for instance, as we saw with Frankenstein. One of the major ways that the text is changed from the text into Hollywood adaptation is providing a heterosexual love interest. I think this is going to be very important because the novel, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, is very much a novel that is absent of female. It's a novel of bachelors, and it oftentimes has been read from a queer lens. So that's something that we will also be talking about with Jekyll and Hyde. And of course, Hollywood trying to make the story more commercial, particularly in the time periods of the 1930s, would give more of a standard love story, certainly, than what we find that's merely implied and suggested in Jekyll and Hyde. But nevertheless, I think the implication is fairly clear. as I will discuss as you read the text. Now, popular culture, as you know, has embraced Frankenstein so much so that there's even a breakfast cereal, or at least there used to be. I don't know if they still make it, Frankenberry. And there was also a Count Chocula. And again, I don't know if they still make that or not for Dracula. My popular culture introduction to Jekyll and Hyde was through a Bugs Bunny cartoon called Hyde and Hare. It's 10 minutes long, and I've included that link in the notes below in the 7th section. And I encourage you to watch that adaptation. I think it's a very clever adaptation. Of course, it is only an adaptation, but it helped to bring the persona of Jekyll and Hyde, which might not be as commonplace as a Frankenstein or a Dracula, to the masses. Something else that I illustrated with popular culture, because as you know, I teach media and popular culture classes, in the 7th section of our notes, is the New York City Club, the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde Club. Now, I've been to the Jekyll and Hyde Club. It's been quite a while since I've been. They, because of COVID, had shut it down, and from what I could tell from the website, it seems that they have reopened. It's one of those theme restaurants. The food from, again, this was quite a while ago. Food mediocre, atmosphere phenomenal. And there was a whole storyline that they had about a Dr. Jekyll who had created a Mr. Hyde who escaped from the lab. The waiters would be dressed as famous movie monsters. There would be screens that would be playing classic horror films. There would be things like portraits that would have moving eyeballs, bar seats that would slowly move up and down so that you would become disoriented. It was really quite the experience. The website doesn't seem to have as much information and detail as it had in the past, so I don't know if if they've cut back on some of their atmosphere or not, but nevertheless, I thought it might be something that you might want to briefly look at. And a video that I do want you to watch, and it's 13 minutes long, is entitled The Bizarre Truth of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And this 13-minute video will give you a good idea of the background of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to prepare you for the text we'll be reading. So that's in the 8th section. Watch The Bizarre Truth of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But I think you'll also enjoy the Bugs Bunny Hyde and Hare. And looking at the website very quickly for the New York City Club might also amuse and entertain. So as we know, the first paper will be due on the 2nd, which is Wednesday of November. And for today's attendance question, what I wanted to leave you with was a discussion about Jekyll and Hyde. Your attendance question response will be due on our class discussion form by Friday the 14th at 8 a.m. And again, if you need an extension, please let me know. But my question to you is, did you know anything about Jekyll and Hyde prior to this course? And if so, what did you know about Jekyll and Hyde? I'm just sort of curious because I know that Frankenstein and Dracula are iconic. I don't know if Jekyll and Hyde are quite as iconic. That said, I can't wait to read your responses. And as you know, you don't have to respond to your peers, but you do have to read your peers' responses and my responses to your peers so that you can get an idea of what the class discussion would have been like. So I'll leave you here to watch The Bizarre Truth of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And hopefully also you'll watch a Bugs Bunny cartoon and enjoy it. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Take care. Bye-bye.